The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency José Ramos-Horta, President of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency José Ramos-Horta, President of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. President.
In the Tetu language, the Derk Manek, in Portuguese, Bon dia, in Bahasa Indonesia, Selamat pagi, in English, of course, good morning. I begin my speech in English. In Portuguese, Excelências, somos uma democracia.
Excellencies, we are a young, imperfect, and vibrant democracy, an oasis of peace, tolerance, and freedom. Since our independence in 2002, our democracy has evolved. It is alive and dynamic. The Economist magazine's Democracy Index rates Timor-Leste as the most democratic country in Southeast Asia. The Reporters Without Borders organization, in their most recent World Press Freedom Index, places Timor-Leste in the 10th global position in freedom of the press. We are a multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual, and multi-ethnic society. With humility, we continue to build a country that is open to the world, tolerant, free of hate and violence. A 98% majority of practicing Catholics live in harmony with our Protestant and Muslim brothers and sisters. Timor-Leste has no political violence, nor tensions or crimes based on ethnicity or religion. We have no domestic organized crime, nor armed robberies. Despite a significant reduction in poverty, multidimensional poverty remains high, around 45.8%, and even higher among children. To bring our population out of extreme poverty, food insecurity, neonatal mortality, rickets, and child malnutrition, and to provide care for children and their mothers are some of the challenges that we are determined to directly confront in the next 5 years. For this reason, child malnutrition and access to preschool education are two of our key priorities. In collaboration with UNICEF, our government plans to implement an intersectorial early childhood development policy in order to drive investments in a child's initial years and build a solid basis for social and human capital. We have a high and unacceptable incidence of domestic violence. However, UN has recognized that Timor-Leste is taking significant steps to implement legal frameworks and international policies, including CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and Security Council Resolution 1325, in order to promote gender equality and women's empowerment. We are an observer state at ASEAN, with the right to participate in all summits of heads of state and government, as well as meetings of ministers, high authorities, and technical staff. During the last 20 years since our independence, and in the 10 years since we formally applied for ASEAN membership, most economic and social indicators show significant progress, including in life expectancy, which was below 60 years in 2002 and is now risen to 70 years, reduced poverty and child mortality, 21 doctors in 2002, and now more than 1,200. In 2002, the capital had partial power coverage, while the rest of the country did not have such privilege. Currently, power is available in 96.1% of our territory. We are very grateful for the Asian leaders' unanimous decision to grant observer status to Timor-Leste. a pathway to membership, and a broad support package to continue to build our staff and diplomats' skills. We do not depend on foreign aid, and we are eternally grateful to those who helped us when our needs were greatest. We financed our own national budget with the returns from a sovereign fund invested in U.S. Treasury bonds and in global financial markets, with an annual return in excess of 9%. Timor-Leste is an active member of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries and a co-founder of the international G7 Plus group, which was established in 2010 in Dili and is formed by 20 countries affected by conflicts.
Ukraine and the resulting geopolitical fragmentation have disproportionately impacted the already fragile and conflict-affected countries. They have always felt the brunt of every global crisis. On the other hand, these countries are the least responsible for those crises. The incidents of extreme hunger, poverty, and the humanitarian crisis caused by wars, climate change, and geoeconomic fragmentation are increasingly concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Conflicts proliferate and economic and social conditions are worsening in countries around the world. But we seem to have forgotten the children of the tragedies of Myanmar, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Palestine, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The growing tensions among regional and global powers are eroding the potential of our collective security institutions at a time when we face existential challenges. We cannot accept the incomprehensible anachronisms such as the embargo imposed on the Cuban people, or the continuing impasse of the Western Sahara conflict, or the blatant disregard of UN resolutions on the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. On and off, we hear about the need to reform the UN Security Council. Academics concoct an expanded Security Council, regurgitate ideas for a more representative body reflecting today's demographics, which is in itself an almost surreal task, bearing in mind that leaders up to the present have not ended nuclear arms race, remain the biggest arms merchants of death, led in the desecration of Mother Nature, failed to help the poorest out of poverty, have not shown wisdom in writing off the debt incurred by countries of the poorer South, burdens caused by loan sharks from Western commercial banks. Children living in conflict zones continue to come under attack on an alarming scale. Recent years have seen an exacerbation of children's vulnerability to grave violation. In Myanmar, unable to control the ground, the military pursue a scorched earth strategy with widespread use of aircraft, helicopter targeting civilians across the country. At least 3,000 civilians have been killed and 70,000 people arbitrarily imprisoned, including the legitimately elected leaders such as Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. Timor-Leste condemned the invasion, violation of sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the ongoing war with its catastrophic consequences for the Ukrainian people, but also for the Russians and for the rest of the world, with the disruption of global trade in grain and energy. We know from experience and history that very seldom wars are won on the battlefield. Miscalculation, false pride prevail, and the war goes on for years. Killings and utter destruction continue until exhaustion. Only then the sides involved decide to begin negotiations on a peace settlement. Why not talk now? Excellencies, people living in fragile circumstances already feel the effects of climate change most severely. We need a new outlook on the climate and security nexus, which will address the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on peace, security, and ensure that the quest for energy transition does not worsen the security situation in vulnerable and fragile countries. Therefore, we would propose a bold initiative. The initiative seeks to accelerate the just energy transition in fragile developing states that heavily rely on oil and gas production to prevent turmoil and unrest. The combined efforts of unlocking finance through debt alleviation, streamlining international finance at lowest interest rates, and significantly increase official development assistance will empower these nations to embark on projects that foster development of clean industries, address the ongoing loss and damage related to climate change, facilitate their efforts in greenhouse mitigation and adaptation to climate change. While initiatives to further the just transition exist, they do not pay enough attention to either fragile or vulnerable states nor to LDCs and SIDS. As a second priority, this initiative will pay urgent attention to particular challenges faced by fragile states that are not only susceptible to fragility and vulnerability on their own, but where there is heightened risk when faced with any massive economic turmoil, which the green transition, if not handled carefully, would increase. Thirdly, as the urgency to transition to low-carbon economy and clean energy accelerate, this initiative will seek to ensure that the quest for rare earth elements and critical minerals does not lead to further instability, nor promote weak governance or exacerbate local tensions, nor grievances in the countries where strategic reserves of such elements and minerals are found. This initiative seeks to create a brighter and more sustainable future for our planet and all inhabitants by facilitating the energy transition in small island states, LDCs, and climate-vulnerable nations. We aim to mitigate climate change impacts and preserve our shared global environment for generations to come. The super-rich CEO of banks and credit countries, in the face of agony of poverty, rising costs in the most impoverished countries, remain indifferent to the calls for debt cancellation. I'm stating here to banks and other credit institutions, cancel off this damn debt. It would be a leap forward in international solidarity if all OECD countries were to allocate 1% of their national GDP to ODA. We would see positive effects on poverty rates, food security, access to basic health services, education, electricity, drinking water, sanitation, housing, or social security, with multiplier effects on the diversification of economies, especially in agriculture. We live in a world full of dualities, an increasing prosperous world whose wealth has increased by 30 trillion a year, according to Nobel Prize winner Kailash Satyarthi, but the leaderships of the G7 or G20 fail to reflect this in the fight against hunger, stunting, and other forms of multidimensional poverty. We need to adopt a universal child benefit, a new ODA target for a fair share for children, targeting particularly children in fragile, low-income countries. Excellence, allow me to remind you the story that is no longer part of our daily conversation, the story of the 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi, an innocent Syrian child whose lifeless body was ashore near the Turkish resort town of Bodrum in September 2005. And how many of us pain at the sight of children dying every day of hunger and in the other ongoing wars. In centuries past, the Atlantic Ocean was the graveyard of African slaves, and those who survived the voyage built new countries with their sweat and blood. In this 21st century, the Mediterranean Sea is the new graveyard of thousands of Africans fleeing drought, extreme poverty, and conflicts. Excellencies, no one should fear the Chinese, Indian, European, American superpowers. Rather, we should welcome the positive reality of global countries that share with us diasporas, cultures, and interests in well-being or security that are deeply intertwined with our own. We can gain more from the free movement of people and goods than from building concrete walls. We all benefit from the impressive Indian transformation into a global economic success story. India has an admirable track record of decades of practical solidarity with other developing countries, even during the early stages of its own development. Equally, we want to see prosperity in Europe, in Japan, South Korea, Australia. But their continuing prosperity depends on peace and stability in the global South, depends on our markets, workforce, and providers of raw wealth, which they process and re-export. But this unequal relationship has to change, and will change only when we invest more in high-quality education and health for our children and youth, when we invest more in science and technology. We have the chance of the century to build a new partnership of equals between the rich, super rich of the North and us in the periphery, with a renewed spirit of mission around the global causes of nature and human survival. Failing this, we will sink together, rich and poor, the weak and the powerful. May God bless us all. Thank you.
En nombre de la Asamblea.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency.